Greetings and welcome to 5.2. Where am I? Here I am. Look, I'm wearing a tie for you. Don't get used to it. Uh, this is our introduction to the skeletal system, and I'm going to touch on just a few major areas. We will do more with the skeleton, obviously, in class, and we'll get into bone histology and pathology in some detail. But I wanted you to have some broad themes with this introductory video. We'll also look a little bit at what bone is, some principal ingredients, the functions, and classification. So with that, let's consider what I consider some broad themes. One theme is that bone is dynamic. Students seem to think that the expression dry as a bone is accurate. In fact, it could not be further from the truth. Bone is a very dynamic tissue that's constantly growing, constantly being reshaped, has a great influence on our metabolism, is a major storage site. So if it were a bunch of just dried up sticks inside of our body, it would not be dynamic. So bone is dynamic. Please keep that in mind. Also recognize that bone is going to get off of here. Bone is also going to be closely associated with cartilage in the skeleton. When we think about the skeleton, we think bone, and it mostly is, but cartilage also has an important role. Since cartilage consists largely of water, it's compressible, and therefore it serves in many places in the body as a shock absorber. It also provides some flexibility and bendability, which gives the skeleton maximum movement capacity. So when we look at this, we see there's several kinds of cartilage represented, and I'm just going to highlight these for you briefly. One type that we see most commonly is hyaline cartilage, and you see that it's on blue here. So you see that in the nose, you see it here as costal cartilage associated with the rib. You see this listed here as articular cartilage. That is cartilage we associate with joints. And then we also find it represented with the larynx and trachea. This kind of cartilage is basically collagen and water. So it has some flexibility, but it also has some compressibility that allows it to serve as a shock absorber between joints, for example. So whenever you hear costal or respiratory or nasal or articular cartilage, that is this kind of hyaline cartilage. Next, we have elastic cartilage. We only find elastic in a couple of places. Since elastic is mostly stretchy elastic, it has the ability to sort of snap back into position, and we only see it really in two places here. You see it in the epiglottis, which is inside the throat. It helps direct the pathway. It helps direct food, for example, to our esophagus, and we also see it in the cartilage of the external ear. So the outer ear, which you can see, that's made of elastic cartilage, and that's really it. The last type is fibrocartilage, and it's a little hard to see here, but you're going to find fibrocartilage in the joints of the knees. You're going to find it at the pubic symphysis, where your pubic brim comes together, and you're also going to find, if you look very carefully, you'll see some red in here. This is going to be in between your vertebrae. Fibrocartilage has a lot of thick collagen fibers in it, and if anatomy reflects physiology, and it does, then you can imagine those thick collagen fibers are going to give the fibrocartilage the ability to handle pressure, and also provide some support and stability to those tissues. So that's why we find it in these weight-bearing or heavy locations, so that it can actually absorb some of that wear that we associate with walking and pressure. And I also want to touch on the fact that the bone, the skeleton here, has multiple functions. Again, most people would associate the skeleton with support and movement, and that's true. It also has a role in protection. The skull protects the brain. The rib cage protects the heart and lungs. The pelvic girdle protects the reproductive organs to some degree. So we do associate that with protection, but maybe some areas that may be less obvious, important roles that the skeletal system has. It's a major storage site for minerals like calcium and phosphate for growth factors, and even triglycerides. Triglycerides may look familiar to you as fats. Yes, in some bones you do store fat. Other roles include hormone production. There's a hormone called osteocalcin that actually is very important to regulate bone formation, but also is involved in metabolism. We associate issues with this sometimes with diabetes or obesity. And one more role, hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the production of blood cells. And some people don't recognize that the bone has a role in even producing our blood. So when you look at the skeleton, I want to dissuade you of the notion it's a bunch of dried up sticks in your body. Very active metabolically with multiple roles. So what is bone? When we're talking about bone, what are we really getting at? You can think of bone in a couple of different ways. We discuss bone as an example of connective tissue. So you can think of bone as just one example of a connective tissue. And of course, connective tissues are going to have a matrix. They're going to have cells. They're going to have the ground substance. So again, we can refer to bone at the tissue level, or we can refer to a bone like a humerus or an ulna or a femur as technically an organ, because your humerus, for example, is going to have a blood supply. It's going to have, of course, bone tissue. There's going to be different kinds of cells we associate with it. So technically, a bone itself is really an organ. So when you're talking about bone, are you talking about the tissue, or are you talking about an organ? So what is bone if we're talking about chemically what makes up one of these things? Well, as an organ, it's going to have, again, multiple parts to it, but a bone has organic and it has inorganic pieces. So the organic pieces, the things that we associate with life or living, with molecules we associate with life, cells, of course, and we'll talk about cells more in class. Proteins, especially collagen, are going to be major ingredients and represent the organic or the synthesized piece of bone. But there's also going to be inorganic pieces, and this term hydroxyapatite refers to the other things, the mineral components that make up bone. And a fair question to ask then is, why does bone have to have both? Why can't you just have the proteins, or why can't you just have the minerals? Well, this shows you indirectly what each of these does. If I take bone and I put it in vinegar, and the vinegar is going to pull out all of the calcium and all of the phosphate and all the hydroxyapatite, all the mineral part of bone, if I do that, bone becomes very flexible and bendy, as you see here, because, well, we'll get to that in a second. The collagen, if I remove the collagen, if I remove the organic pieces of bone, which I can do by cooking a bone, by putting a bone in an oven and cooking it, and essentially breaking down the protein piece of bone, then I get this. I get a bone that's very, very brittle and breaks very easily. So that does hopefully show us what each of these does. Without the mineral, bones become bendy. In other words, the mineral part makes bones hard. Without the collagen, we have this. So the collagen is going to keep the bone from becoming too brittle. It provides a little bit of flexibility or bendability because of that protein. So, and we'll talk in class about some conditions where someone can actually have a disease called brittle bone disease, and we'll talk about the source of that. So bone has organic parts, and that's going to give the bone some structural integrity and some flexibility. It has the mineral piece to give it hardness, so it can be structurally strong and supported. This just shows you, if you look at the chemical composition of bone, the major ingredients, and you see the total inorganic pieces and the organic pieces. So bone is roughly 1/3 organic and 2/3 inorganic. I find this chart here, though, quite interesting. It shows you what the bone stores. 99% of the body's calcium, 99% of the body's phosphate, 80% of carbonate, 50% of magnesium. So this once again reinforces the fact that bone is a very important storage region for minerals. And finally, let's talk just a little bit about how bones can be classified. What you see here is some different ways we can look at bone in terms of an overall classification scheme. We can describe bone, for example, bones, as either being axial or appendicular, depending on where they are in the skeleton. Over here, you see the axial part of the skeleton is blue. It's the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. Axial refers to, if you will, the body's main body axis, and of the bones here, let me move this over, of the 206 bones in the body, 80 of them are considered axial. The other 126, the ones you see here in pink, are considered appendicular. Appendicular refers to appendages, in English, arms and legs. So the bones that make up the arms and legs are appendicular. It might confuse you slightly, as it does a lot of people, that the hip bones, for example, and the shoulder girdle, you see here the clavicle, back behind here is the scapula, that these are also considered appendicular. The bones that are either the arms and legs or connect the arms and legs to the axial skeleton are also considered appendicular. So doing the math then, about 126 of the body's bones are considered appendicular. So most of our bones actually are associated with our limbs, and 80 of them are associated with the body's main axis. Some other ways of looking at bone, we can discuss gross anatomy, which refers to, is a bone considered spongy or compact? And that's a discussion we'll save more for class. But when you're holding a bone, you have your hand around compact bone, densely packed bone. But also you can find spongy bone in many places, and that's the bone that's not spongy soft, but it looks spongy because of the arrangement of some of the internal structures. And we'll talk about that in class. Bone can also be classified according to shape. It can be classified as short, irregular, flat, or long. And I have here this chart just to show you a little bit of this. Bones that are longer than they are wide are considered long bones. So like the humerus and the femur, the tibia, these are some obvious ones. But even the phalanges, the bones that make up your fingers, are considered long bones because they're longer than they are wide. Some bones, like the sternum, for example, is considered a flat bone, and we'll look at its internal anatomy in class. Short bones are approximately about the same distance this way as they are this way. So if you think about a short bone being roughly squarish, then that's going to be a good definition or a good way of seeing a short bone. And then there are some bones that just really are not long, they're not short, and they're not flat. Like an example would be the bones of the vertebrae, the vertebral column rather. So vertebral bones are considered to be irregular because they're not long or short or flat. They have different shapes to them. So we will talk about that anatomy in class 2, why a long bone has a very different anatomy in terms of its inside structure than a short, flat, or irregular bone. And finally, just bone markings. This is going to be more of a lab discussion, but I just showed you over here that bones are not just rods. There's going to be areas where they're going to have projections on them, or they're going to have areas where they're going to have some indentations. You'll see words like ridge or fossa or sinus or line, and these terms actually refer to markings on the bones. We'll talk about what those do in class also. I want you to be aware that bones are going to have not just a name, but they're also going to have distinctive markings on them that will show, for example, where muscles will attach or where blood and nerves pass through. Okay, that's our introduction to the skeletal system. We'll talk more about it in class. See you there.